Let's talk about the job interview. We're already assuming that you did all of the good stuff that needs to happen to get to the interview. And that's networking, that's applying, that's creating a resume. But now we're at the point where we're at the job interview. For many people, this is where they just kind of wing it. They don't want to sound rehearsed. They don't know how to rehearse potentially. So they just go into it cold. I don't think that's the best idea personally. I have interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of people throughout my career, and it's very obvious when someone is not prepared for an interview. There are some people that come off as too scripted, and I'm going to give you a heads up on that. One of the tools that's available right now for many people with maybe a tech background or someone who's adventurous in tech is they may use an online assistant, something like ChatGPT, to help answer their questions. I would guard against that myself, just personally, and this is just my thought. And the reason is it becomes very obvious when someone has done that they're just reading from someone else's words or another entity's words, in this case, an online artificial intelligence, which sounds very crazy to say that in this day and age, but it is something that we're seeing creep into interviews. Not necessarily a bad thing to help you prepare, but make sure the answers you give are your answers that come from your experience. So after today, what we're hoping you get is to know how to prepare for an interview, know the various types of interviews and how they're different from each other and how they combine sometimes for an interview experience, how to communicate your best image in an interview. And we always get a lot of questions about online interviews, and we'll do that. We'll talk a little bit about that. A really important thing is how to answer key interview questions. If you practice some of the key interview questions, that's half the battle. If you're prepared for those, they're always going to give you some you're not prepared for, and that's fine, as long as you come prepared for the standard ones. Know how to handle difficult questions. And this is based on your own job experience. You know, if you were fired from a job, if you were laid off from a job, if you've been out of work for a number of years, that may pose some challenging questions that you may anticipate. How you handle those determine whether they become an issue in the hiring process. We'll talk about the STAR method, and we'll include in the follow-up emails a worksheet to help you practice what are called STAR questions, and then post-interview steps such as thank you letters, interview follow-up, and how you can communicate after the process has completed. So first off, let's talk about preparation. It's my hope that any interview you get is based off of the research you've done to that employer, meaning that you've researched them well enough that your resume reflects how your skills and ability match their needs. Sometimes that doesn't happen. I understand that. Sometimes we apply for a bunch of jobs and we may not have thoroughly researched an employee, but are lucky enough to get an interview. When you get an interview, the expectation is you're going to know who that company is, what their needs are, and how you can fill those needs. So researching is incredibly important. One of the things you can do is you can go, of course, on the web and you can look them up on their homepage. Even small companies have a fairly large web presence nowadays. What I like to look at is the About Us or Contact Us tab. If you click on that, it'll tell you in many cases about the history of that organization. And it can even give you information about their value statement, their plan going forward, just kind of who they are as an organization. Remember that the homepage is for the customer, who they're selling their services to. The About Us is their chance to tell you a little bit more about who they are and what they value. You want to know the skills they need, and this is really important that you save the job postings that you applied to, that you responded to. Just copy them, save them to a document, keep them in a folder. Once they start interviewing, it may not be as easy to find that information. You might have to actually ask them for it. I prefer you have it. The reason for that is once they start interviewing, that job is no longer open and you can't find it online. So a good tactic is every job you apply for, keep a folder just to keep some notes in, but also to copy that job posting there. That'll tell you all about the skills they need. You also want to check your attitude. And by that, I mean, are you presenting as someone who wants this job? One of the biggest mistakes, and I made a lot of them in interviewing, is that at the end of an interview, I was once asked, do you even want this job? And it was a job I really wanted, by the way. I hadn't shown that. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm not asking you to be, over excited for something, but just show that you're interested in this line of work and try to convey why you want to do it for this employer. If you don't do that, they may just think that you're applying for a bunch of jobs and you just happen to fall into this interview. At the end of the day, when I interview, I want to know that this person wants to work for this organization in some other capacity, or it's for some other reason than just the wage. I get it. All of us want to get paid and hopefully paid well for the work we do. However, everyone wants that. Other than that, why do you want to work there? And if you can show that to an employer, they're going to hopefully get a sense that there's other reasons besides pay that you want to work here. And people who show that generally work longer at an organization. People who are just there for the pay will go to another organization very quickly if they're willing to offer even a little bit more money. There are other reasons to work for a company than money, and one of those job satisfaction. That's a huge part. And of course, there's some other research you can do into the fringe, the things like vacation, sick time, benefits. That's a huge part of the overall offer that you will be receiving. So make sure you're researching that so you can show that, hey, I'm really interested in this job. And then look good. This has changed dramatically, I think, throughout the pandemic, in that people dressed up a lot more for interviews than they do now. Don't overdress for an interview. If you're going for a job that doesn't require a suit and tie, don't wear a suit and tie. But if you're dressing for you're preparing for an office type work, think about what would be the best day. What would I dress for on the best day, the most important day of that job? And let that be your guide. Again, employers are looking for people with a positive work attitude. Not only that you want to work there, but that you will be a net positive to this organization. One of the biggest red flags I've seen in interviews is when someone brings up negativity in the interview. Some questions you may hear may seem to prompt that. It may say, tell me about your worst boss. That's not your opportunity to vent about a horrible relationship. Just talk about why it was challenging. Reframe it into, here's what I was presented with, and here's how I impacted that situation for the betterment of the organization in that relationship. When you bring up negativity, it really, for lack of a better word, taints the interview. And that's really the impression that is left. So let's talk about and by the way, Lana will interrupt me by turning her camera on when there she goes. Do we have some questions, Lana?
I just have one question. I know the answer though. It says, is saying that I am so into the job that I would do it for free?
No, don't say that. That puts you at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to salary negotiation. Just say, I'm drawn to this type of work. I feel very strongly about it, and I'm very happy for this opportunity to work for a company that shares some of my values. That would be a better way to go for it. So we're going to talk about some of the different types of interviews. Be aware that most interview processes are a combination of several of these. So they're not, don't worry about, hey, did I get into this interview? Was it a selection? Was it behavioral? Was it a work sample? All three of those can be wrapped into the same hour-and-a-half process. So the first one is the telephone interview. A lot of people think of this as a screening interview. Sometimes the actual interview may take place on the telephone. Usually that is, if they're going to do that, it would be a video interview, but sometimes it's still screening interviews through a telephone call. Be prepared for that. If someone calls you, is your voicemail professional? Think of it. If you're an employer and you called your voicemail, would you be impressed? Would your Would you think less or more, or be, kind of benign on that? The reason I ask is most people don't even know what their voicemail says. So check it, call in, find what your outgoing message is. I like to have, when I call somebody, I want to know I got a hold of a person, not just a phone number. And many of the automated responses are, you have reached 555-555, whatever. Please leave your name and number. That doesn't tell me anything. Leave a message such as, hello, you have reached Art Larson. I'm not available to take your call right now, but if you leave your name and number, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you and have a good day. Simple as that. That tells them that they reached the person they intended to reach, and it's got a positive inflection to it. Don't put any cute kind of emails or cute voicemails that your kids put together. I've heard those. I've heard silly ones that I've hung up on, unfortunately. Make sure that it's as professional as you want people to perceive you as. During the telephone screening, it's often an opportunity for an employer to just see, is it worth bringing you in for an hour-long interview? It's very expensive to interview people. If it's a 3-on-1, even a 2-on-1, think of it. That's an hour, hour and a half of someone's time, multiple people's time, taken away from the productivity of their job. If they bring in someone who is not worth interviewing, means someone who's not interested in, who is not interested in the position, or isn't who they say they are on paper, they've wasted sometimes hundreds of dollars. Even with video interviews, this is true. So a screening interview will just be some basic questions for you to answer, to see if you're who you say you are, to see if you're still interested in the position, and if it's worth it bringing you on for that next step. By the way, if they call you and you're not prepared for that, it's okay to say, I'm in transit right now. I'm going hands-free on my car, but if you give me an opportunity to pull off to a rest stop, I'd be happy to give you a call back, or you could call me back in 15 minutes. They're not going to remove you from that opportunity simply because you were being safe. Again, if you're in a Walmart supercenter and you're pushing a cart, probably not going to give your best to let them know, I'm out shopping right now, but I could get back to my car in the next 15 minutes and I could give you a call back. Remember, you always want to present your strongest case that you are the professional person that they're looking for. By the way, another thing to mention, not all interview processes will follow what I'm talking about. For some interviews, showing up is the interview itself. And they may be, like, what are you doing if you try to do all of these tactics I'm talking about? What I'm talking about is that, for this types of interviews, I'm talking about that, career job you're looking for that is really going to move you up to that next level in your career. But all jobs are important. Entry-level positions lead to that next position, lead to that next position. Many of us would love to jump into our dream job right off the get-go. That's not always possible. Employers are looking for a strong foundation of skills brought about through work experience. If you ever wonder, why is education normally at the bottom of a resume? And the reason is, once you have work experience, that trumps a lot of the education that you've spent a lot of time and effort on. If you've just graduated from a college, congratulations. That's probably the most important thing on your resume right now. But as soon as you start in your career, that education becomes less and less important. It sometimes is a requirement for applying for a job. It gets you in the door, but your experience is what will ultimately allow them to make the decision. So let's talk about in-person screenings. I've done this a few times. It's just for large hiring events, very similar. You're going to be asked maybe some five quick questions, 45 seconds to a minute answer, short, to the point. Again, they're just trying to push that on to the next level of in-person interviewing. A selection interview is usually at the end of the process. Sometimes it doesn't even happen. Sometimes the standard interview makes someone stand out, and that's the person that they interview. In other cases, it might be set up where they're going to do it at multiple stages, or they may have two candidates who are very close in their scoring, and they need to bring it to that next level. So they take the top two candidates, and that becomes a selection interview. And you might be able to meet with several people that work in that organization. and they're going to evaluate your skills and abilities and your fit within that organization. Basically, is your past work experience and what you find value in line with what we find value in. Behavioral interviewing is usually part of most interviews. This gives kind of situational awareness. Questions will require you to describe how you handle work-related situations. So, like, give me a situation in which you had to deal with a difficult customer. How did you handle it and what were the results? Many people believe that these are not easy to prepare for because you don't know what they're going to ask you. They're literally 50% of all interviews seem to be behavioral based, if not more, questions. I will tell you that they're fairly easy to prepare for if you're willing to put in the work. And in a couple slides, we'll be talking about the STARS technique that allow you to prepare for most of the behavioral based interview questions you're likely to encounter. A group or peer group would be when it's kind of two interviews, really. It's a group interview would be you interviewing alongside other potential candidates. Some employers want to kind of compare apples to apples, and they'll have 5 candidates interviewed at the same time. Depending on the type of job, you react differently. If it's like a human services job, you may look for your other candidates and be looking for, do you see this? Or have you experienced this? Or I'm sure in your line of work, you've run into this also. If it's a sales position, they may be looking for someone to be a little more aggressive and really kind of take center stage. It just depends on the type of job you're applying for. A peer group would be when you're interviewing along potential coworkers. I really like that. I always like to have a potential coworker involved in the interview panel because they see things from a different perspective than maybe a manager or HR person would. So that's an opportunity to ask questions at the end of, what's your typical day like? Because it's going to tell you what that typical day in your, if you were to get that job, would be like. And then one of my favorites, which are a little harder to set up, is a work sample. A work sample is an employer saying, hey, here's an aspect of the job. I want you to perform it within this interview. So like a welding shop. Great that you tell me how you deal with difficult people, but I really want to know how you weld. So the majority of that interview would be you going down to the welding shop and performing a timed weld potentially. I know some employers in Duluth do that. For myself, if I'm going to hire someone to facilitate a workshop, such as the one I'm doing today, the best indication I have of how they would do that is if they give me an example. If I tell them, hey, what I'd like you to do as part of this interview is give me a 10-minute presentation on resumes. That's not how they talk about how they would do it. They can show me how they would do it. So it's a great opportunity for you to stand out based on your skills, not talking about those skills. So we'll talk a little bit now about communicating your best image. I'm sure you've heard these numbers. They change a little bit based on whoever talks or whatever study they're talking about. But 80% of communication is nonverbal. And that means like my inflection of voice. If I were to say this entire presentation in a very monotone voice, you may assume that I'm not really interested in being with you here today. But through the inflection, through my hand gestures, through just a little bit of body motion, I'm hoping you're getting that this is something I'm very passionate about. I love talking about interviews. I think interviews are something that everyone can improve on, and therefore I really like giving people the tools to do so. When you're preparing for an interview, the first step on that interview day, make sure you're a little early. This is more difficult when you are doing a video interview, because like for video interviews, you may not be able to get online until right at the time of the interview. That's a great question to ask, though. When they call to schedule the interview, if it's online, just say, I usually arrive 5 minutes early for these interviews. What is your process? Or if it's in person, make sure that you know the exact address. If possible, drive it the night before, know where your parking is. You'd be amazed at how many people still show up late for interviews. That can happen, and it's not a deal killer. If you arrive late for an interview, sincerely apologize one time and then go on with the interview. Don't let it tank your interview. Don't assume you're not under consideration. You have a little ground to make up on, but that's fine. I've hired people that have arrived late for interviews, but they've explained it, and then they talked about the skills that they could bring to this job. They didn't focus on that one little thing that was a little hiccup in the process. I always like to say park at a lot, not a meter, if you're in that situation, because if you're at a meter, you're going to be worried about the time. Take all the time they'll give you. Don't limit yourself by saying something like, oh, if we're just about done here, I do have a meter that's about to run out. Park at a lot if at all possible. Okay, so let's talk about showing and telling. Always have backup examples of anything you say. Like, what are the results of what you talked about? So if I say, tell me about a process that helped improve the bottom line of your company that you initiated. Talk about it, but then always back it up with this resulted in. Not all questions will offer the opportunity to give you results, but if at all possible, go to the results, because that's what I'm going to remember. That's the outcome. That's the effect that something had. And also emphasize your commitment to learning. If a job requires something that you don't have, be prepared to how willing you are to overcome that deficiency. So for example, if you got to an interview and one of the preferred qualifications was a intermediate to advanced level of Excel knowledge, and you just never understood Microsoft Excel, spreadsheets have never been something you've ever had to use, there's free resources online. In fact, I'll be including some of them in the follow-up for some free computer training. It's much better to say, currently I'm taking a course, or I'm enrolled in this training for something, than saying I haven't had to use that in my work, my past work, but would be willing to learn. Tell them you are learning. And if you haven't started that yet, start it today. 10, 15 minutes a day of some learning to help your career is a really good investment. And depending on the type of work you do, it varies on what's available. But it could be something like if you were a maintenance custodial person. I used to do maintenance custodial training. And the next level of maintenance custodial for many of the people I was working with was to obtain their boilers operator's license, their special engineer license that would allow them to work under a master boilers license, and they could work on boilers. That's a huge extra accreditation that if someone were in process with, they could probably take the test within a couple of months or a month, and they would add extra value to that position. So every job actually has some ability for advancement that we ourselves initiate through our own research into trainings that are available. All right, I'm just going to check in real quick with Lana before we move on. Lana, any questions we need before we finish up with this slide?
There's a question, but I kind of think I already gave the answer. Someone inquiring about if an employer says a certain degree is required, should they still apply for the job if they have the relevant experience?
So if you ask any HR person, they will say no. That is a requirement. It's tricky because there is some gray area. Maybe you're a couple credits short of the degree that's required. Maybe you're in process with the degree that's required. There may be some leeway. Either they will accept you or they won't. What I would guard against is applying for every position under the sun, that even if you're not qualified for a company, because if they see you always, if they see 4 or 5 a week from you and these are jobs you're qualified for, it can cause them to look at your next application in a different light. Really, you should be applying for jobs that you meet the minimum qualifications for, but there is a little gray area in some of those cases. It's a case by case situation. It's a great opportunity to reach out. I always think that if you can find a reason to connect with an employer and jump through all the hoops it takes to get to that person, you're going to show an interest that other candidates haven't shown. And it's an opportunity for you to get like an impromptu interview. I've done that before for people I've worked with, in which we've sometimes taken days to find out someone we could talk to, turned into an interview on the spot. So those are some opportunities for you to connect with an employer. Now, I don't say connect with every employer you apply to. That sometimes that's a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. In most cases, it shows interest, but always have a reason for applying, have a question you want answered. And sometimes that can be as simple as checking on the where your application is at, if you're still under consideration. But don't call like every day and say, hey, I haven't got an interview yet. What's going on? That can obviously create a bad impression. At the end of an interview, think of the interviews you go on. You're very seldom, if ever, going to be the only person they interview. So you're in competition with other people. So if I interview 5 people for one position, that means any one person has a 20% chance of getting that job. So the 20% success rate, there's an 80%, I'm not going to use the word failure, non-success rate. Okay. Now, not everything is always equal. Sometimes there's internal candidates. Sometimes there's a known opportunity, and they may go for that. You may be a stranger to them at that point, maybe just introduction. But let's just say all those other things are off the table. What it means is you're going to not get more jobs than you get at the interview stage. However, all interviews have value. You're going to learn something from them. So it's very important to evaluate the interview right after you're done, right when it's fresh. Write down the questions they asked you. Write down as much as you can remember about the responses you gave. Because I will tell you, I can't remember one question from the last interview I was on that I was a participant in. I don't remember any of them. How am I going to improve the next time if I don't know potentially what I did wrong or could have improved on the previous time? When I did placement years ago for another organization, we always did we called it a post-mortem. That sounds horrible. I probably should have used a better term. But after the interview, I'd always have them call me, the candidate call me and say, how did it go? And some would say it went great. Some would say it went horrible. But we would talk about what went great, what didn't go well, what questions did they ask, how did you answer them? Really good idea to use the Career Force resources to do that. Set up a one-on-one. Most Career Force locations have one-on-one appointments. Schedule one after an interview and just talk through the process. Get some, or use your network. Contact someone that you used as a reference. Let them know how the interview went. Ask them for their advice. You know, here's how I answered a question. What do you think? And then also follow up after the interview, even if it went horribly. It's a good idea to send an email or a letter. I know a lot of people don't think letters are a good thing anymore. I personally do. I think they show a willingness to go above and beyond, but sometimes that can be a little tricky. At least send an email that says, thank you for this opportunity, and then recap 1 or 2 points based on what you thought went well. You know, I appreciate the questions you asked about customer service. That's something I've always taken great pride in. Even if you think you didn't do well in the interview, still follow up. I've had at least 3 people that were embarrassed about how poorly they did in the interview. I still had them send thank you cards, and all 3 of them got the job. You don't know how they're going to interpret how well you did, or you're not going to know how poorly the other candidates might have done. We're generally too hard on ourselves, so always assume that you're still in the running. And this includes the end. At the end of an interview, don't just kind of trail off and you know, oh, thanks, I appreciate you taking the time. Say, if I didn't make this clear throughout the interview, I want you to know that I really am interested in this position and working for your company. I think I have a lot to add to your organization, and I'm very excited to hear about next steps. Great. It leaves them with a positive impression. Also, if you say you're going to follow up on something, if you say, well, I'll send you that, or I'll call you next week if I don't hear from you, put it in your calendar and follow up as you said you would. It's your one opportunity to show how you do what you say you will do. So let's talk about handling some tough questions. One method for handling tough questions is a sandwich method, which is sandwiching a negative situation between two positives. So for example, tell me about your worst boss. I actually like that question. Some people don't, and I understand why, but I like it because I've got a great example. I always talk about, I was in a position in which I really, really liked the work I did and the clients I served, but I was having a tough time with communicating with my direct supervisor. I was working in Duluth. She was down in Minneapolis. Most of our communications were over the phone. They were always seemed rushed, and it was very difficult to meet her expectations. So what I did was I made sure I shared my calendar with her. I made sure she knew what I was working on, and I made sure that I was prepared for each of our weekly phone conversations. Once I put a little prep work into those conversations, it went a lot better. And once I adapted to her communication style, I found that I was able to learn a lot from her. And she is actually one of the people that is my reference for this position. So positive, negative, positive. You're leaving them with the results of how you affected that situation. And you can anticipate some of these questions. One of the toughest ones is, why did you leave your last position? I see a lot less employers asking that question than they have in the past, but be prepared for it. Don't lie. Don't say you were laid off if you were let go, but come to an agreement with yourself about what information you're going to disclose on that. These are all situational. They're all too specific for me to give anyone, here's how I would handle it. Make sure that if you have been let go through performance issues or something similar, talk with a career force representative in your area, explain the situation to them, and then come up with the best possible answer that you could give that doesn't add any undue negativity. No one likes to get let go. No one does. It's a difficult thing to deal with, but it doesn't have to limit your opportunities. A lot of people get fired every day, and many times it's through no fault of their own. Sometimes it is, but it's not an issue going forward. That's what employers really are looking for. And the reason they ask is they want to know, is this going to affect me? Will whatever happened be replicated when you work for me? And if you can come up with a short, logical reason why it's not, that's all they're really worried about, and they'll move on to the next question. Keep it brief. Don't go on and on. And then focus on skills throughout all of your challenging questions. Always bring up something positive. Maybe it's something you learned. Maybe it's somehow you adapted to the new work culture. Whatever that happens to be, give them a reason for this is positive moving forward. I did promise we would talk about the STAR method, and I want to dedicate as much time and see where we're at. Looks like we got about 20 minutes left together. I could talk about this all day, but we'll spend the next 5-10 minutes on this. So some of the key interview questions that you'll get are going to be situational, and it will be things like, talk about how you've had to adapt to someone's communication style, like I just talked about, or tell me a time when you had to deal with a difficult customer. What they're looking for is how you professionally handled it to the best results of all involved. That's what I always rephrase that question. I always add that. How do you handle it to the best results of everyone involved? Because there are certainly like horror stories you could talk about. So when they say, give me your worst situation, that's the one time I don't want to say tell a little white lie. I'm not going to tell them about, someone just coming in and throwing stuff around and screaming and leaving. Unless I can talk about, well, it was someone's duty to clean that up. So I took it upon myself to reorganize everything. And I suggested some options to prevent this from happening in the future. I mean, almost any situation can be turned into a positive story, but don't make things up. If you don't have a positive results at the end of that bad situation, go with another option, go with another story. A great thing you can do is to go online and just go on Google or whatever your search engine of choice is, and type in top 30 behavioral based interview questions or top 20 or whatever. You'll get different ones. In fact, I really recommend you check a bunch of different websites. Get the questions from there. Don't get the answers from there. The answers need to come from your experience, and they have to be results. The results have to be at the end of it. If you go with someone else's questions, you're not going to be able to, excuse me, someone else's answers. You haven't lived it, and there are no results. So go online to look at the questions and practice as many as you can. You'll find, this is what's really cool, this is what I learned in practicing interviewing over and over and over again, that even though there's a million different ways to ask a question, I can use the same stories to answer most of them. So you could ask about a bad customer infinite number of ways, but I'm still going to use the same story to answer the question. So it's not that there's, a bunch of questions out there that I don't have examples of. It's just, what example do I use to answer this particular question? If you prep enough of these, you're going to find that they go into certain categories: dealing with coworkers, dealing with supervisors, dealing with customers, showing your creativity, going above and beyond. There's just some standard categories. If you have a question, if you have an example, you slightly adjust your answer to meet what they're requesting. So the process is, you talk about the situation, what happened, and then kind of how you determine what are the tasks here? How am I going to improve this situation? What needs to be improved? And then the actions you took to make those improvements, and then the positive results, and I put a PR here, positive results of those actions. Like I said, I'm going to send you a STAR method worksheet. Print them off, use it online, whatever. Take a scratch piece of paper, put STAR. And if you practice answering some of these questions, 1 or 2 a day while you're in your job search, at the end of a week, you've got 10. You've got 10 solid examples that you've prepped for, and you're just waiting for the opportunity to talk about. I can't tell you how much relief that gives you in knowing that you can prepare for these questions that maybe you thought, I have no ability to prep for these questions. You do. Look them up online. They're pretty standard. I think interview questions have gotten a lot less creative from employers. And the reason is they don't go off script very often, especially larger employers. They need to make sure that all questions are the same for all candidates for there to be an equal opportunity. So you're less likely to get a question that's specific to what they see on your resume than you had in the past. I don't necessarily agree with that in all cases. It doesn't allow me to ask some things I really need to know as an employer, but it's to your benefit. And the reason is it's kind of created a more standardized pool of questions you're likely to get. So here's some key interview questions you might hear. And the first one, I think, is one of the most important ones you'll get, because it's open. It's wide open. You can answer however you would like. You can give them as much information as you like. Remember that in the interview, you have more control than they do. Sure, they ask you the questions, but they spend, tell me a little bit about yourself. That took 3 seconds. I've got 60 to 90 seconds to answer that question. So I'm giving you a lot more information than you are actually requesting. Let me rephrase that. I take more time up in the interview than the interview panel does. I'm providing more content. So when they say, tell me about yourself, rephrase that as, tell me about how your past work experience relates to the needs of this current position. That's how I rephrase it. And the reason I do that is because if I don't, I just start talking about myself. Oh, I really like looking at birds. I'm a birder. I've been very passionate about birding for the last 10 years. I like to go biking. I like to go on nature hikes. I like all this stuff, none of which has anything to do with the position. But because they told me to tell me about myself or tell them about myself, I went to where I was comfortable, things I'm passionate about, things I like to talk about. I once had to stop somebody after 20 minutes. I should have done it much, much sooner, my fault, but they just kept going on and on and on because it was a comfort kind of ledge for them to say, I can talk about myself all day. Prep 60 to 90 seconds of what they need to know about you for this position. Another question is why you're interested in working for this company. Again, I think I mentioned at the very beginning, I need to know that you want to work for me in this line of work. And if you prep some information on that, it's a very easy question to answer. A lot of people don't like this question, but it is still asked. What is your major weakness? Many thought processes on this. I'm going to give you mine. I like to think of it as I'm going to give them something I'm currently working on, not something that I've overcome, because that's not the question they asked. They didn't say, what's a weakness you've overcome? They said, what is a weakness? I'm not going to give them a deal breaker. If I'm someone who can't show up for work on time, I'm certainly working on that, but I'm not going to let them know that. I'm probably going to talk about some aspect of the job that is not a requirement, but maybe it's a preferred qualification, and what I'm currently doing to become better at that. So if public speaking is part of the job, maybe you do Toastmasters. Maybe you practice recording yourself giving presentations, and then you get feedback from people. Maybe you do an counter. You ask someone to be your counter. An counter is those what we call interrupters that we do when we're speaking. If I say something and then say well, like I was going it's very, very disconcerting for someone who is listening to someone speak. And so that could be something you're currently working on. Again, don't focus on it. Don't overdo it. Short to the point. Here's what the weakness is. Here's what I'm doing to overcome it. And I'm very positive about the results I am currently experiencing. More importantly, what are your strengths? What's the number one thing they need to know about you for you to get an opportunity for this job? This is a perfect opportunity for you to let them know that. If they don't ask this question, I always add it at the end. At the end of an interview, someone will say, or someone will ask, do you have any questions for us? If there's something that has been left off the table that their questions didn't allow me to talk about, then I'm going to say, I did have a couple questions, but if you don't mind, there's something I wanted you to know about my past work history that's very relevant. Is that okay? They're never.
All right.
All right, Lana.
Oh, I couldn't hear you for a second. Okay. We lost sound for like two to 3 seconds, but you're back.
Sorry about that. Well, hopefully that wasn't the most impactful thing I was talking about today. All right, and then can you give me an example of how you solved a problem? Kind of a behavioral-based question. It should be one of the main ones you have a great star story for. And then this one, where do you see yourself in 3 years? I have had a lot of people ask questions about that. If you're close to retirement age, highly recommend you go to that Job Seeking Over 50. But if you can't wait for that, think about 3 years. Most employers don't want to invest in someone if they're not going to be working here in a year. 3 years, that's a lot. That's actually a lot within anyone's career. Most people switch jobs every 3 to 5 years, if not even sooner. So that's a long time for someone to be working for one position. And by one position, I mean it may be multiple positions within a company that you're working at, but those would be changes in position. So if it's a larger company, it's not a bad idea to say, one of the reasons I applied for this position is the career opportunities this would present. I'm extremely excited to do the work being offered, but in 3 years, I would hope that I've shown enough growth in this position to maybe be considered for some additional opportunities within this organization. Remember, they're hiring you for the job you are applying for, but they also want someone who maybe will pay off for years to come. I've worked for the state for 13 years now, and this is my 4th position with the state. It's a great, I will advocate for working for the state to anybody. It's a great opportunity. It's the largest employer in the state of Minnesota is the state of Minnesota. So if someone were going to apply for a position with me, and they said in 3 years, I would hope that there would potentially be some additional opportunities so I could take that next step in my career with this organization. Great. That shows a lot of forethought and someone's thought about it. But at least have an answer. And again, this is a great question to work through with the career force representative to make it specific to your career trajectory and the type of work you're interested in doing. And then why did you leave your last job? That's a really, really tough one for most people to answer. And like I said, another question that should be handled one-on-one, but I'll just give you some situational. If it were, let's say that someone had been let go because of, well, I'll give you the number one. The number one reason for anyone being let go is for attendance. And you can say that, for example, during my last job, I was dealing with a sick family member that did require me to exceed the attendance requirements for the position. Previous to that situation, I had had excellent attendance for the past 5 years, but in my last year of employment, I did exceed what was allowable. My employer did work with me to the best of their ability. However, it became a situation where they could no longer accommodate the absences I needed to have. That is no longer an issue. That situation has now rectified itself, and I look forward to continuing the excellent attendance I've shown throughout my career, other than that one blip with your organization. Again, that's the number one reason for most people being let go. Explain what happened, take ownership of it. Notice I did throw my former employer under the bus saying they weren't willing to work with me. I'm not going to lie, but in many cases, there's a lot of different ways of telling the truth. Come to something that you're comfortable with, that tells the situation, explains it, and then moves on in a positive note. And then don't offer if they don't ask. Don't offer information that they didn't ask for. There are sometimes in an interview, I've seen people offer way too much information that I never would have even asked about had they not offered it. And then the last step, after the interview, make sure that you're contacting your references. Like I said, this is an opportunity for you to improve for your next interview, but it's also a little heads up. You may be receiving a call. I'm hoping you'll receive a call about this awesome interview that I just took part in. I'm very excited about this, and here's why. If you show excitement for the opportunity and they contact that reference, they're going to say something like, I know Art could do really well in this position. I know he's very excited about the opportunity, and here's what I experienced when I worked with him. You can't tell them, here's what I want you to say, but you can make the connection for why they're a reference. Choose your references wisely. Talk to someone who can make the case that you could do a good job in this position. I think it's a great idea to have, kind of a group of references, and then you draw upon them for which ones are most relevant to the position you're currently applying for. Most employers, not all, but most employers only check the references or call in references for the chosen candidate. Some will call on all, but many will just call on the one that they're most interested in. I'm going to give you a tip that I found very helpful in job search. Don't wait until they've already made the decision, and by they, I mean the employer, to bring your references into the equation. Your references are hopefully the people who know the most about you and are the most willing to help you in your job search. That's why you chose them as references. Bring them in at the beginning of your job search. Have a cup of coffee, do a video call them on the telephone. Explain that, hey, I'm looking for work. I really value your input as a reference. And I wanted to talk through some of the things I've been doing since we last had a chance to work together. And I'd really appreciate any tips you may be able to give, or any referrals to positions within your company potentially. They can have more value than just being an after the fact call that an employer makes. Lana?
Yes, thank you. I have two questions here. The first question is, shouldn't you offer the fact that you was eliminated in case they contact the employer and learn that you no longer work there?
So on the application, they may ask why you left your last job. They may ask, is it okay to contact the employer? on the application, when they say reason for, reason you left the position, say involuntary separation, but then have an answer for it if they ask in the interview. So you're never lying, never, ever, ever lie in an interview. It disqualifies you if they find out. But the fact that you didn't tell them in the interview that you were let go, they didn't ask. And on the application, if they asked, you said involuntary separation. Every situation is a little bit different. And I do recommend you contact someone and talk through your specific situation. It could be something like you're in a small town and they're going to know, or they already know, and you want to kind of smooth over that perception that you were totally at fault. I totally understand that. But in most situations, you're going to go with, unless they ask me a specific question, I'm not going to answer that, but I will be truthful in anything they ask for. You had another question?
Yeah, they're rolling in now. I don't know what happened.
Right.
The next question was, what should you do if you only have one reference and the employer is requesting multiple?
Got to be a little creative. I've had my pastor as a reference. I've had a former teacher as a reference. Don't ever assume someone has to be a reference. No one has to be a reference. But if you don't have references, start developing references. It's important because if you don't have a reference, that means that you have a very limited network. And networking is how we get most of our jobs. Most jobs are achieved in some manner through networking, that people you know who know you. Get on LinkedIn, start creating an online profile, start connecting with people. I know it can be difficult. Sometimes you do have to get creative, but expand your ideas a little bit more about who could be a reference. Don't ask someone you just met. I mean, if you were to reach out to me and say, Art, could you be a reference? I would have to decline. And the reason is I don't know you. And when a reference puts their reputation on the line for someone, they're saying that I vouch for this person. Who can vouch for you? When I was young, it was people that I babysat for. People I babysat for got me my first kind of real job. Babysitting is a real job, but I was, very young at the time. They're referring me to someone else, got me my lawn mowing job, which became a handyman job, which became the next step and the next step and the next step. So really develop your references, and that's developing your network. Again, if you're looking for ideas on that in your specific situation, reach out to the career force in your area, and they can give you some tips based on your life history, your career, and the area you live in. I think we have time for 2 more questions, Lana.
Okay, so the one question says, what do you say when they ask you a question that you never heard of before and your brain shuts down at the moment, besides taking a deep breath? Also, what happens if the extra example that you have on hand is not relevant to the challenging question? I think you answered that already, but okay.
Well, I'm glad they asked it, because you're not going to have a ready answer. I mean, no matter how much you prepare for, they could ask you some left field question that you just have nothing. Think about it for a little bit. Don't give up on it right away. But if you can't come to something, use a little silence. That's fine. But then say, nothing's coming to me right now. I would really like to give you a good answer on this. Could we circle back to this at the end of the interview? Now, perfect situation is you have a great answer for every question. That's not the reality of most interviews we're on. It's okay to do that. But they will come back to it. And then after the interview, write that question down. This is something I need to prep for the next interview, potentially, if you don't get that position. I just had someone do this a couple interviews ago. They handled it very well. We circled back to it. They didn't have a great answer, but they had an answer. And that extra time gave them what they needed to come up with something.
And then this is the last question, because we had room for 2, but the other question in here is very relevant to it. So I'm going to kind of put them together. The question was, does involuntary separation include both being fired and job being eliminated? I wouldn't want to think that I was fired when I wasn't. And then the other question that came in with that was, how do you know when you were fired, if you were fired?
Great questions. Awesome questions. So number 1, involuntary separation, leave that for in place of terminated, fired. If you were laid off or position no longer exists within the company, then go into more details, because a lot of people who were fired will say they were laid off. So give me more examples. Part of a company-wide layoff of over 40 individuals, or position was outsourced to home headquarters in New York, no longer exists within this location. If it's not a firing, add a little bit more information. And then Lonnie, you said there was another part to that. I'm sorry, I already escaped me.
They were just trying to determine somebody, it's kind of very the similar, same question in my mind. They're trying to determine when they were,
Oh, yes.
how to determine if you were fired or if you were laid off.
It is a different question in that you don't know. The other one assumes you do know what it is. If you don't, you wouldn't believe how many times I've talked with somebody and said, I was fired from a job. We talked and it wasn't fired. They were laid off or the position no longer exists. As long as that's what the employer will say, that's what you say. It doesn't matter what you think in your mind, ask the employer. So it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but call your former employer and just say in a positive way, because it's not going to do you any good to be nasty about it. Call and say, hey, I'm applying for positions, and one of the questions they ask is, why did you leave your last job? And I want to make sure I didn't receive a separation letter. What does it say in my file so that I may accurately, do this? If they say it was a layoff, if they say it was whatever, that's what you use. No matter how it felt in your mind, go with the most positive thing you can truthfully say. And again, reach out to your local career force. I'll say that one last time, to work through your specific situations. I've talked people off the cliff of saying they were fired. I can't tell you how many times. And it really kind of lightened their load, because now they could go into that interview knowing that they had that in their back pocket, that if they were asked, not only could they say what was the truth, but if they checked with the former employer, that's what they were going to say because they asked them that. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we're right at 11 o'clock. Perfect. Look for that follow-up email by the end of the day tomorrow. We have either resume or interviewing going on Wednesday, and then every Tuesday we have the next creative job search. I wish you the best of luck in your interview coming up. I hope you have some coming up, but if they do not end in a job, remember, every interview process is valuable. You're going to learn something of it as long as you think of, how can I do better next time? How can I improve on what I already did fairly well? How can I take that next step? Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon, a great morning, and we'll talk to you soon.